I call David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I just want to invite the Minister, as Kennedy Graham has just done, to actually make, to reply to his SOP that he's put up. I mean, on the face of it, we've only seen it obviously recently. I mean, that's in some ways a function of the way that this has been sped through, so we haven't had a chance to perhaps look at these things because they've only really been contemplated perhaps over the last few days. But on the face of it, I don't see it as being unreasonable. We do mention the Security Council Resolution 2178 in the commentary, where it's not mentioned specifically in the bill itself. And it would seem to me that given that this is a narrow piece of legislation, it's there for a particular purpose, in part to comply with Resolution 2178, that it wouldn't be unreasonable to look at that seriously. The definition that Mr Graham has put up it comes out of 2178. It doesn't cross over some of the discussion that we had in the Select Committee, which was around trying to redefine terrorism and Terrorism Act, which was a much bigger event that we would probably have to look at as a result of the bigger review that we go into. Instead, this just looks at and refers to what this bill is ultimately just about. So I think that the SOP is a thoughtful one and a good one, and we might want to invite the Minister to perhaps take a call on it and give his thoughts on what he might think of it. I want to just mention more specifically, there's really about a number of issues in this legislation that we're looking at. There's the Passport Act that people have spoken on. There's the amendments to the SIS Act, the Custom and Excise Act. They're the three acts that are being modified as a result of this bill. And there's a number of contentious pieces of change that we've spent some time on: visual surveillance, warrantless surveillance, the passports issues, the interim nature of this, and access to the customs and excise databases. I want to speak on the first of those that I just mentioned, which is visual surveillance. It was put to us in the committee that there was an imbalance or an inconsistency between the SIS and the police. The police had the ability to conduct visual surveillance, the SIS didn't, and that was in part, it was explained to us, because the SIS Act was very old, and much of when the SIS first came into being, putting a camera in somebody's room would mean a sort of a 2 foot by 2 foot object in the corner of a room, and obviously it would be kind of noticed. That's not the case obviously anymore, and these are invisible to people who are if it's in their office or their car or their house or whatever. That's no longer the case. They can't observe it. We had a long discussion about this, and the difference between the threshold that it relates to the police and that which relates to the SIS. And this is a point that was made by both the Legislative Advisory Committee and the Law Society as well, that the police is given that by a consenting judge where there is, and there's actually a little bit of disagreement between the LAC and the Law Society between a 7-year imprisonment term and a 14-year imprisonment term, but it had to relate to a crime that was undertaken, was seriously thought was going to be undertaken, was in the process of being undertaken, and it had that seriousness of charge, a 7-year or 14-year imprisonment period. With the SIS, it's somewhat different. The threshold's very different. I mean, it's about whether we suspect or we have an issue around knowing that something unsavoury, if you like, might actually happen. And I think in particular the issue of and why we came to the position that we did, which was to make sure that if this provision was going to be brought in, it was made very narrow and contingent on Mr. Mr. Chair, very contingent on the ability of whether it was a related to terrorism or the conducting of a terrorist act. And this was really to safeguard, I think, the definition that we were looking at and the broader definition of security which the SIS works under. And the broader definition of the SIS meant that it would look at, for example, and this is in the SIS Act Part B, which is the identification of foreign capabilities, intention or activities within or relating to New Zealand, quote, that impact on New Zealand's international well-being or economic well-being. And we felt that that threshold was a low threshold to enable this broadening of powers within the scope of this piece of legislation. So what we were looking at in terms of this bill was to ensure that we took a narrow view of what the threat was and related any measures that needed to counter that threat by the SIS to only that threat, which meant that related only to the threat or the carrying out of a terrorist act. What we were very concerned about, without the ability to have a look at this bill in a wider context, was that we would enable visual surveillance to take place under the guise of a threat of terrorism, but would relate to the much wider functions of the SIS, and we didn't believe that that was the right thing where we wanted to go. Obviously, any piece of any visual surveillance needs a warrant. There is another part in the legislation which about warrantless surveillance. I'll come to that later on in the debate. But I do believe that that is means that a warrant has to go to the Commissioner for warrants. It has to go also to the Minister. And in addition to that, the Inspector General of Intelligence needs to be informed as well. So we have an ability to have those safeguards in this interim piece of legislation that I think will enable us to have, the public to have much more confidence that we've got the balance right. In addition, if the information that is obtained under that warrant for visual surveillance, once it's been used, it must be destroyed. Once again, we've got in a sense, a safeguard that this won't be kept in perpetuity. And the director of the SIS must be sure and have the sufficient evidence to ensure that a warrant for visual surveillance is well and truly justified. So visual surveillance, as many of the submitters said to us, is a far more intrusive form of surveillance than perhaps tapping somebody's phone or looking at somebody's computer. It means that there is a camera inside your house, your bedroom, your office, your car, wherever. It therefore is beholden on us to make sure that that was as narrow, the scope for allowing that to happen was made as narrow as possible. It was very much related to the bill itself. And I think, sir, that we have ended up in a place where it doesn't allow a backdoor for visual surveillance to be used across the broad spectre of the SIS's abilities and responsibilities, but is restrained and constrained to that alone. And I do believe that we've struck a reasonable balance on that. Now, I'm sure when the broader review comes into being, there's going to be a very strong submission made by the SIS that it needs to be, that its powers need to be enhanced with regard to visual surveillance. I do believe that it's not simply a question of saying the police have got it, therefore we should have it. I don't believe that that's a good enough argument that was made by the Law Society as well. They are operating in different circumstances, and on the basis of that we should be looking at the thresholds quite differently as well. Thank you, Mr.